Welcome back, my friend. Before tonight's story begins, take a quiet moment for yourself. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let tonight's quiet journey begin. Tonight, we begin a journey that moves slowly across the ocean, so slowly that time itself seems to stretch and soften. In 1519, a small fleet of ships left the shore, not knowing how far the world extended or where the water would lead them. They were not trying to go around the world. They were only trying to find a way through it. And for a long time, there was nothing but water. Before the ocean became endless, before distance lost its meaning, there was only a decision to keep moving forward into something no one had fully seen before. The world before the journey. There was a time when the shape of the world was not something people could see. It was something they imagined. Maps existed, but they were incomplete, not because people lacked skill, but because there were places no one had ever reached. Edges were filled with uncertainty. Lines faded into empty space, and beyond those spaces, there were only assumptions. For most people, the world felt large, but still contained. It had boundaries that made sense. Land connected to land. Sea separated one place from another. Travel followed patterns that had already been established. Merchants moved along familiar routes. Ships followed coastlines. Exploration happened, but rarely without reference to what was already known. The idea of crossing an entire ocean without knowing where it ended was not just difficult, it was unsettling. And yet, in the early 16th century, this uncertainty began to shift, not all at once, not in a single moment, but slowly as knowledge expanded and ambition followed it. Europe was changing. Trade had become more than movement. It had become power. Spices, in particular, were no longer simple goods. They were symbols of wealth, control, and influence. Cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, small things, light enough to carry in a hand, but valuable enough to reshape economies. And most of these came from a distant region known loosely as the Spice Islands. Reaching them was not easy. Portugal had already established a route. They sailed east, around Africa, across the Indian Ocean, toward Asia. It was long, but it worked. And because it worked, it gave them an advantage. Spain, meanwhile, needed something different. Not just another route, but another possibility. A way to reach the same destination without following the same path. And that idea, simple in theory, was complex in practice because it required a different way of thinking. Instead of moving around the edges of continents, it suggested moving across the unknown, westward, across an ocean that no European fleet had ever fully crossed, with the intention of continuing beyond it. It was not just a question of distance, it was a question of belief. Was there a way through? Did the continents connect in ways that blocked the path? Or was there an opening somewhere that could lead to another ocean on the other side? At that time, no one could answer with certainty. There were theories, there were calculations, but there was no confirmation. And without confirmation, any attempt would be a risk. Not a small one, a complete one, because once a fleet moved far enough into the unknown, turning back would no longer be simple. Supplies would run low, weather would become unpredictable, navigation would depend on estimation rather than precision. And yet, this did not stop the idea from forming. It only made it quieter, more deliberate, less about confidence and more about persistence. Among those who considered this possibility was a man named Ferdinand Magellan. He had experience at sea. He had seen established routes. He understood how trade worked. But more importantly, he understood something else, that the known paths were not the only ones that could exist. His belief was not built on certainty. It was built on absence, on the idea that what had not yet been found might still be there, a passage, a way through, a connection between oceans that no one had confirmed. He did not begin with a large audience. His proposal was not immediately accepted. In fact, it was rejected by the country he first presented it to. Portugal did not need a new route. They already had one. There was no reason to invest in something uncertain when something proven already existed. So Magellan turned elsewhere, to Spain, and Spain, at that moment in history, was willing to consider what others had dismissed, not because it was safe, but because the reward, if it worked, would be significant. Control over trade did not require many ships. It required access, and access depended on direction. Magellan offered that direction, west, across the Atlantic, beyond the known coastlines, toward a passage that may or may not exist. It was not a guaranteed plan. It was not supported by complete data, but it was structured enough to be considered, and eventually it was approved, not as a certainty, but as an attempt. 5 ships were prepared, not identical, but sufficient. They were supplied for a long journey. Food, water, equipment, crew members from different backgrounds, some experienced, some not, all of them entering something that could not be fully described because there was no example to compare it to. Departure did not happen in a moment of celebration. It was not marked by confidence. It was quieter than that, measured, deliberate, because those involved understood something clearly, that once the ships left the harbor, the world they knew would begin to fade behind them, and what replaced it would not immediately make sense. There would be long periods where nothing changed, where the ocean looked the same from one day to the next, where direction was maintained not by landmarks, but by calculation, and within that environment, time would begin to feel different, not faster, not slower, but less defined, because progress would not always be visible. Distance would increase, but without reference points, it would be difficult to measure, and that uncertainty would become part of the experience, not something to overcome quickly, but something to carry day after day. As the ships moved further west, they would leave behind more than land. They would leave behind certainty, and in its place, they would enter something else, a space where decisions mattered more, because outcomes were not immediate, where patience was not optional, and where the idea of reaching a destination was always balanced by the possibility of not finding it at all. This was not yet the journey itself. It was the moment before it, the point at which everything still existed as an idea, a direction chosen without full knowledge of where it would lead. And in that sense, the most important part had already begun, not when the ships moved, but when the decision to move was made. Departure and the weight of direction. When the ships finally left Spain, the movement itself felt ordinary. There were no dramatic changes in the beginning, no sudden shift in the world. The harbor receded slowly. Land remained visible for longer than expected, and the sea, at first, did not feel different from what the sailors already knew. This was not yet the unknown. It was the edge of the familiar. The fleet moved as many fleets had before. Sails adjusted to the wind. Voices carried across the decks. Routines began to form almost immediately. There were tasks to complete, lines to secure, navigation to maintain, and in those early days, it was still possible to believe that this journey would follow a pattern, that even if the destination was uncertain, the experience of getting there might still resemble something known. But distance has a quiet effect. It does not announce itself. It accumulates. Each day, the ships moved further west, and with each day, the connection to what they had left behind became less immediate, not gone, but less present. News could not follow them. Instructions could not reach them. And whatever decisions were made from that point forward would remain with those on board. This was not unusual for long voyages, but in this case, the distance carried a different weight because there was no clear return point, no mapped route that guaranteed a way back, only a direction west, and a belief that somewhere along that direction there would be a continuation. At first, the ocean cooperated. Winds were steady, currents were manageable, the ships maintained formation without difficulty. There was space to think, to observe, to settle into the rhythm of movement. Meals were still regular. Water was still sufficient. The structure of daily life remained intact. And because of that, the deeper uncertainty remained quiet, not absent, but distant. Magellan moved among the ship not as someone reacting, but as someone maintaining. His role was not to solve immediate problems. It was to hold direction, to ensure that the fleet did not drift from its purpose before that purpose could be tested. And for a time, this seemed possible. The Atlantic Ocean, though vast, was not unknown. It had been crossed before, not in the same way, not with the same intention, but enough that it did not immediately resist. Days passed, then weeks. The horizon remained consistent, a line that separated sky and water without offering detail. And gradually, that consistency began to change something in the way the journey was experienced, not in a dramatic way, but in a subtle one. Time began to lose its markers. Without landmarks, without variation in the environment, each day resembled the one before it. Morning light, midday brightness, evening dimming, night, then repetition. And within that repetition, the sense of progress became more abstract. They were moving, but it did not always feel like movement, because nothing around them confirmed it. There were no visible signs that they were closer to anything, only the knowledge that they were further from where they had been. And that difference between knowing and feeling began to widen. Some adapted to it. They focused on tasks, on structure, on the predictability of routine as a way to remain grounded. Others began to notice the absence, not of land, but of change. The ocean did not shift to match expectation. It remained, and in remaining, it created space for thought to move inward. Questions that had once been theoretical became more immediate, not asked aloud, not discussed openly, but present. Where does this lead? How far does it go? And what happens if nothing appears? These were not questions with answers that could be checked. They were questions that had to be carried quietly, without resolution. Magellan did not remove these questions. He did not replace them with certainty. Instead, he continued forward as if the direction itself was enough. And in a way, it had to be, because turning back at this stage would not answer anything. It would only confirm that the unknown had remained unknown. So the fleet continued, not because doubt was absent, but because it was not yet strong enough to interrupt movement. The ships adjusted to weather patterns as they encountered them. Small changes, nothing extreme, but enough to remind them that control at sea was always partial. The wind could assist, or it could delay. The ocean could support, or it could resist. And in those variations, the illusion of stability began to soften. Still, nothing had gone wrong. No crisis, no visible threat, only distance and time and direction. By the time they approached the coast of South America, the journey had already begun to change, not externally, but internally, because what had started as an idea was now becoming an experience, something that could not be reversed without consequence, something that required continuation, not because it was easy, but because it had already begun. The coastline appeared gradually, not as a destination, but as a transition, a line between what had been crossed and what still remained. And standing at that point, with land once again in sight, it might have seemed as though the journey was returning to something familiar, but it was not, because from that moment forward, the path would not follow the known routes. Along the coast, it would begin to search for something that had not yet been found, and that search would change everything that followed. Following the edge of the continent, when the coastline of South America came into view, it did not feel like an arrival. It felt like a continuation. Land was there, but it did not provide answers. It only changed the shape of the unknown. The fleet adjusted its course, moving south along the coast. At first, this movement brought a sense of direction. There was something to follow now, a visible line, a boundary between sea and land that offered structure after weeks of open water. But that structure was limited because the purpose was not to reach the land. It was to find a way through it. And that meant that every stretch of coastline had to be considered not as a destination, but as a possibility. The ships moved carefully, not quickly. They watched the shape of the shore, the way it curved, the way it opened, the way it closed again. Every inlet mattered. Every break in the land was observed, because somewhere along that edge there might be an entrance, not large, not obvious, but enough to allow passage from one ocean to another. Days passed in this pattern: movement, observation, adjustment. The coastline stretched longer than expected. It did not end. It did not open easily. It continued, and with each extension, the question returned: is this the place, or is it further ahead? The weather began to shift, gradually, almost unnoticed at first. The air cooled, winds changed direction more frequently. The sea, though still manageable, lost some of its earlier predictability. These were not extreme changes, but they were enough to alter the rhythm. Tasks required more attention. Sails needed more adjustment. Navigation demanded greater care. And within these small changes, the sense of ease began to fade. Still, the journey continued. The ships remained together. Communication between them was maintained. Signals, visual cues, shared movement. And for a time, this coordination held. But beneath it, something else was forming. Not conflict, not yet, but a difference in how the journey was understood. For some, this was still an expedition, a structured effort with a clear goal. For others, it was becoming something less defined, less certain, because the longer the coastline continued without revealing a passage, the more the original assumption began to feel like a question. Was there truly a way through, or had they committed to a direction that would not resolve? These thoughts did not disrupt the journey immediately. They remained quiet, contained, but they influenced perception. Each bay that closed instead of opening carried more weight. Each turn in the coastline that led to more land rather than water felt more significant, and slowly expectation began to change from anticipation to observation, from confidence to patience. Magellan did not shift his approach. He maintained the same course, the same process. Follow the coastline, watch carefully, continue. His decisions were not reactive, they were consistent, and in that consistency, he created stability, not by removing uncertainty, but by not allowing it to interrupt movement. The fleet adapted to the changing environment. As it moved further south, colder air, longer nights, different patterns in the sky. These were not just physical changes, they affected perception. Time felt different here, less defined by daylight, more influenced by the conditions of the sea. And in that environment, the journey became more internal, less about where they were going and more about how they were continuing. The coastline offered no clear signal. It did not confirm or deny the existence of a passage. It simply remained, extending further than expected, and that extension began to change the scale of the journey. What had once seemed like a search along a limited edge now felt like movement along something much larger, something that did not reveal its structure easily. Supplies were still sufficient, the ships were still operational, nothing had failed, but time was being used, and unlike distance, time could not be recovered. Each day spent moving south was a day not spent reaching the destination, and yet there was no alternative path to take, only continuation. At certain points, the fleet paused, not completely, but enough to assess, to observe more closely, to consider whether a particular inlet might lead further inward. Most did not. They curved, they narrowed, they ended, and with each one, the pattern repeated. Expectation, approach, observation, return, then forward again. This repetition did not create immediate frustration, but it created awareness, an understanding that the passage, if it existed, would not be obvious. It would require persistence, not force, not speed, but continuation. And that realization began to define the journey more clearly, not as a direct route, but as a process of elimination, a gradual narrowing of possibility, until eventually something different would appear. But at this stage, that difference had not yet emerged. The coastline continued, the fleet followed, and the unknown remained just beyond reach. The first signs of strain. As the fleet continued south, nothing changed suddenly. There was no single moment when the journey became difficult. Instead, the shift came gradually, so gradually that it was difficult to notice when it began. At first, it was only in small things, a longer pause before responding, a slight hesitation in routine, a glance toward the coastline that lingered a little longer than before. These were not disruptions, they were adjustments, but over time they began to accumulate. The journey had now extended beyond what many had expected, not in distance alone, but in uncertainty, because every mile traveled south was a mile without confirmation. No passage had appeared, no clear opening, only continuation. And continuation, when it leads nowhere visible, begins to change how time is experienced. Days no longer felt like progress. They felt like repetition, the same horizon, the same motion, the same unanswered question. Still, the fleet remained intact. The ships held formation. Orders were followed. Tasks were completed. On the surface, everything functioned, but beneath that structure, perception was shifting. Not everyone experienced the journey in the same way. For some, for a king, this was still a matter of discipline. They focused on what could be controlled: navigation, maintenance, routine. They reduced the journey to its immediate path, and in doing so, they preserved a sense of stability. But for others, the absence of visible progress began to matter more, not because they lacked skill or experience, but because the journey was no longer supported by evidence. There was no sign that the passage existed, only the belief that it might. And belief, when extended over time without confirmation, begins to require effort. Not physical effort, but mental. The effort to continue without resolution. The effort to trust a direction that does not yet justify itself. Magellan did not change his course. He did not offer reassurance in the form of certainty. He continued as before, measured, deliberate, uninterrupted, and in doing so, he created a different kind of pressure, not through command, but through consistency. Because when a leader does not adjust in response to uncertainty, those who follow must decide how to interpret that stillness. Some saw it as strength, others saw it as risk. The environment continued to shift. The further south they moved, the more the conditions changed. Cold became more present, not severe, but persistent. The wind carried a different weight. The light felt lower, less direct. These changes did not stop the journey, but they altered its tone. It was no longer a movement through open, familiar waters. It was a progression into something less known, something that did not respond in expected ways. At times, the fleet slowed, not by choice, but by necessity. The wind did not always cooperate. Currents shifted, and in those moments of reduced movement, the sense of stillness became more noticeable, because when motion stopped, even briefly, the awareness of distance becomes sharper. How far have we come? How far remains? And how much of that distance is real rather than assumed? These questions did not require answers to exist. They only required time, and time at sea was always present. Supplies were still managed carefully. Nothing had yet reached a critical point, but awareness of limitation began to grow, not as urgency, but as background, a quiet understanding that everything on board was finite. Food, water, energy, and even patience. There were moments when the coastline appeared to open, small inlets, curved stretches of land that suggested possibility. Each one was approached with attention, carefully, not with excitement, but with focus. And each time, the result was the same. The water narrowed, the land closed, the path ended, and the fleet returned to the outer edge, then continued south. This pattern repeated enough times that expectation adjusted. Hope did not disappear, but it became quieter, less immediate, more distant. Something that existed not in each moment, but across the journey as a whole. And within that shift, the meaning of continuation changed. It was no longer about reaching the passage quickly. It was about not stopping, about allowing the search to continue even when it did not yet produce results. This required a different kind of endurance, not the endurance of crisis, but the endurance of absence, of remaining in motion when nothing confirms that motion is leading somewhere. And that form of endurance is difficult to measure because it does not show itself in visible struggle. It shows itself in persistence, in the decision to continue without immediate reward. By this point in the journey, the fleet had moved far enough that turning back would no longer feel like a simple correction. It would feel like an ending, an acknowledgement that the attempt had not resolved, and that possibility began to take shape in different ways for different people, not as a plan, but as a thought, a direction that remained available, even if it was not yet chosen. Magellan did not address this directly. He did not frame the journey as success or failure. He continued to frame it as movement. As long as the fleet moved forward, the outcome remained open, and in that sense, the journey had not yet reached its defining moment. It was still building toward it, quietly, gradually, without announcement. Somewhere ahead, the coastline would change, not in a way that could be predicted, but in a way that would be recognized only when it appeared. Until then, the fleet continued south along an edge that did not yet reveal what lay beyond it. The edge of endurance. By the time the fleet moved further south, the journey had already changed, not in direction, not in purpose, but in how it was felt. What had once been an idea was now something lived through day after day, and that difference began to settle in quietly. The coastline still stretched ahead, unbroken, unresolved, but the longer it continued without revealing anything new, the more it began to feel like something else, not a path, but a test, not of strength, but of duration, because nothing in the environment forced a decision. There was no storm that demanded immediate action, no visible barrier that required a change of course, only the same condition repeating. And within that repetition, the journey became more internal. The fleet had now entered a region where the seasons began to shift more noticeably. Cold did not arrive all at once. It settled gradually, first in the air, then in the water, then in the way movement fell. Hands worked more slowly. Wood felt harder. Metal carried a different weight. These changes did not stop the work, but they altered the effort required to continue it. Sails needed adjustment more frequently. Wind patterns became less predictable, and in those small disruptions, the sense of control became less certain. Still, the fleet moved forward, not quickly, but consistently, and consistency at this stage was more important than speed, because the objective had not yet changed. Find the passage, even if it had not yet appeared. There were moments when the coastline seemed to open wider than before, subtle changes in its shape, a curve that extended inward, a gap that seemed to hold possibility. Each time, tension shifted, not dramatically, but enough, because even after weeks of repetition, the idea that the next turn might be different had not disappeared. It had only become quieter, more restrained. Approach, observe, evaluate, and once again, the result returned to the same pattern. The water narrowed, the land closed, and the fleet returned to the outer edge, then continued. The repetition did not create immediate frustration. It created something slower, a form of awareness that settled beneath the surface, the understanding that the journey might take longer than expected, not slightly longer, but significantly. And with that realization came a subtle shift in thinking. Not everyone noticed it at the same time, but it emerged quietly in how decisions were interpreted, in how silence was experienced, in how time was measured. Days were no longer counted by distance alone. They were counted by continuation, by how long the fleet had maintained direction without confirmation. And in that space, endurance took on a different meaning. It was no longer about reacting to difficulty. It was about remaining within uncertainty, without resolving it, without escaping it, without allowing it to interrupt movement. Magellan continued as before. He did not accelerate. He did not hesitate. He maintained the course, and in doing so, he defined the journey, not by what it revealed, but by what it required. The ships themselves showed signs of time, not damage, but use. Wood shifted slightly under changing conditions. Rigging required more attention. Small repairs became part of the routine. Nothing critical, but enough to remind those on board that everything present was being slowly consumed by the journey. Supplies remained under control. Rationing had not yet become severe, but awareness of limitation continued to grow, not as fear, but as calculation. How long can this continue? How far can we go before continuation is no longer possible? These questions did not need to be spoken. They existed in observation, in the way resources were handled, in the way decisions were made, and in the way silence began to carry more meaning. The further south they moved, the more the environment reduced itself. Less variation, less distraction, more uniform. The sea, the sky, the coastline, repeating. And within that repetition, the mind began to adjust, not by resisting the pattern, but by adapting to it. Thoughts became slower, less reactive, more reflective, because there was nothing immediate to respond to, only continuation. And in that state, the journey became less about movement and more about presence, about remaining within a process that did not yet resolve. Some found stability in this, a rhythm that did not demand change. Others found difficulty in it, because without change, there was no signal that anything was progressing. Both experiences existed at the same time, on the same ships, in the same conditions, and neither one could be confirmed as more accurate than the other, because the outcome had not yet appeared. The coastline continued, the fleet followed, and somewhere ahead, beyond what could currently be seen, something different still remained possible. But at this stage, that possibility was not yet visible. It was only carried quietly as the journey moved forward. The season of stillness. As the fleet continued further south, the change did not arrive as an event. It settled slowly, almost without announcement. The air carried a different weight now, not sharp, not severe, but persistent. Cold did not interrupt movement, but it remained with it, in the wind, in the water, in the surfaces of the ships. It was no longer something that came and went. It stayed, and with it, the rhythm of the journey shifted again. Days became quieter, not because there was less to do, but because less needed to be said. Tasks continued, sails adjusted, routes maintained, repairs completed, but the energy behind those actions felt different, more measured, more contained, because the environment did not invite urgency. It invited endurance. The coastline still extended ahead, unbroken, unresolved, but now it seemed less like something to follow and more like something that continued on its own, independent of the fleet, unaffected by their presence, and in that realization, a subtle distance formed, not physical, but perceptual. The land was there, but it no longer felt like a guide. It was simply another element that remained unchanged. At certain points, the fleet reduced its movement, not entirely, but enough that progress became less visible. Wind patterns did not always support forward motion. Currents shifted in ways that slowed advancement, and in those moments, the journey entered a different state. Not movement, not rest, but something in between, a kind of suspension where time continued, but direction felt less defined. These periods did not last long, but they were noticeable because when movement slows, awareness increases. The absence of change becomes more apparent. The sound of the water, the creaking of wood, the movement of air, small details that had once blended into the background now carried more presence, and within that presence, thoughts had more space. Not active thoughts, not questions that demanded answers, but observations, simple, unresolved, the kind that remain without needing to be completed. The crew adapted in different ways. Some maintained strict routines. They followed schedules, even when the environment did not require them, because structure provided a sense of continuity, a way to move through time without depending on external change. Others allowed the rhythm to shift. They worked when needed, rested when possible, let the pace of the environment shape their actions. Neither approach was right or wrong. Both existed side by side, and both reflected something deeper, an attempt to remain steady in a space that did not offer clear direction. Magellan remained consistent. He did not alter the course in response to slowing progress. He did not introduce new urgency. He continued to hold the same direction, and in doing so, he reinforced the nature of the journey, not as something that responded quickly, but as something that required time. Time not as a measure of distance, but as a condition of experience. The ships showed the effect of continued exposure, not damage, but presence. Surfaces worn slightly, edges softened, small repairs integrated into daily routine. Nothing that threatened the journey, but enough to remind those on board that everything was being gradually shaped by where they were. Supplies remained under control, carefully measured, not yet scarce, but no longer abundant. Each use carried awareness, not of immediate lack, but of eventual limit, and that awareness did not create panic. It created attention, a quiet form of calculation that remained in the background. How long can this continue? Not as a question that required an answer now, but as one that would matter later. The environment remained consistent. Sea, sky, land, repeating, and within that repetition, the mind adjusted again, not by resisting it, but by simplifying. Thoughts became fewer, not because there was nothing to think about, but because complexity required energy, and energy over time is conserved. Attention narrowed to immediate tasks, to immediate surroundings, to what could be observed without interpretation. And in that narrowing, the journey became quieter, not easier, but more contained. The idea of the passage did not disappear, but it moved further away from each individual moment. It became something that existed across the journey as a whole, not something expected at the next turn, but something that would appear when it was ready, if it was there at all. This shift did not remove uncertainty. It changed how uncertainty was held, not as tension, but as presence, something that remained without needing to be resolved immediately. And in that state, the fleet continued slowly, consistently, along a coastline that still did not reveal what lay beyond it. The journey had not yet reached its most difficult point, but it had entered a different kind of space, one where progress could no longer be measured by change, only by continuation, where doubt begins to form. By this point in the journey, nothing had gone wrong. There had been no disaster, no storm large enough to break the fleet, no loss that could not be managed. And yet, something had begun to change, not in the sea, not in the land, but in the way the journey was understood, because the absence of resolution had now lasted long enough to take on its own weight. The coastline continued, unbroken, unanswered, and with each extension, the original assumption began to shift, not disappear, but change its form. At the beginning, the passage had been expected, somewhere ahead, something that would appear once the distance had been crossed. Now, it was no longer something expected. It was something being questioned, quietly, without declaration, but present. The fleet continued to follow the same pattern, movement along the edge, observation, evaluation, continuation. Nothing in that structure had failed, but nothing within it had yet produced a result. And that difference began to matter, not immediately, but gradually, because repetition, when it does not lead to change, begins to create space for doubt, not sudden doubt, not conflict, but something slower, a reconsideration of direction, of purpose, of how long continuation remains the right decision. These thoughts did not appear all at once. They formed in small moments, a pause that lasted slightly longer, a glance exchanged without words, a decision questioned, not aloud, but internally. And because they were not expressed openly, they did not disrupt the structure of the journey, but they existed within it. And over time, they became more defined. Some began to measure the journey differently, not by how far they had come, but by how long they had continued without confirmation. Time, which had once felt like movement, now began to feel like extension, something that stretched without resolving. And in that stretching, the question returned, how long can this continue? Not as urgency, not yet, but as awareness. Magellan did not respond to this shift, not because he did not recognize it, but because the nature of the journey did not allow for reassurance. There was no evidence to offer, no visible sign that could confirm the decision, only the direction and the decision to maintain it. This created a difference between leadership and experience. Magellan held the course as something that remained constant. For him, the journey was defined by continuation. For others, the journey was defined by what it had not yet revealed. And between those two perspectives, a quiet tension began to form, not conflict, but distance, a difference in how the same reality was interpreted. The environment did not respond to this shift. The sea remained, the coastline continued, the sky offered no change. And in that stillness, the internal movement became more noticeable, because when nothing outside changes, attention moves inward. Thoughts become more present, not louder, but clearer, simpler, more direct. What are we doing? Where does this lead? These were not questions that required immediate answers, but they were no longer abstract. They had become part of the journey itself. The ships continued their routine. Tasks were completed. Navigation maintained. Nothing visible had broken, but the meaning of those actions began to shift. Work was no longer just work. It became continuation. Each task completed was not just part of the day. It was part of sustaining direction. That distinction carried weight because sustaining something without confirmation requires more than effort. It requires agreement, not spoken, but shared. And that agreement was beginning to change. Not completely, not yet, but enough to be felt. The further they moved, the more the coastline resisted interpretation. It did not open. It did not end. It continued. And in continuing, it removed the possibility of simple answers. There was no clear point where the fleet could say the passage does not exist, but there was also no point where they could say it does. And in that space, between those two possibilities, the journey entered a new phase, one defined not by discovery, but by uncertainty that remained unresolved. Some adapted to this. They accepted the condition as part of the process. Others began to hold it differently, not as something to endure, but as something to question. And that difference did not yet disrupt the fleet, but it changed the atmosphere, subtly, quietly, in ways that could not be measured, but could be sensed. The ocean did not respond. It did not acknowledge the shift that was taking place. It remained as it had been, endless, indifferent, unchanged. And within that unchanged space, the journey continued. But now it carried something new, not visible, not spoken, but present. The beginning of doubt. The point before change. By the time doubt had begun to take shape, nothing outward had yet changed. The fleet still moved. The coastline still extended. The structure of the journey remained intact. And yet, the experience of that structure was no longer the same, because once doubt appears, even quietly, it alters how everything is perceived. Not immediately, but steadily. The same horizon no longer feels neutral. The same repetition no longer feels stable. What once felt like continuation begins to feel like extension, something being carried forward without confirmation that it will lead anywhere. This shift did not break the journey. It did not interrupt movement, but it changed the meaning of that movement. Each decision to continue was no longer automatic. It became intentional, even if that intention was not expressed, even if it was not acknowledged. It was there, in the way time was experienced, in the way silence began to hold more weight. The coastline remained consistent, unbroken, unresolved, but now its consistency began to feel different, not as guidance, but as resistance. Not because it actively blocked the fleet, but because it did not respond. It did not offer variation. It did not signal change. It simply continued. And in that continuation, it created a condition where progress could not be confirmed, only assumed. Magellan maintained the same course. He did not adjust direction. He did not accelerate. He did not retreat. His role remained unchanged, to hold the path until it revealed something. And in doing so, he created a fixed point within an environment that offered none. But a fixed point can be interpreted in different ways. For some, it provides stability, a sense that something remains certain even when everything else does not. For others, it creates tension, because when direction does not change, despite uncertainty, the question becomes sharper. How long should this continue? This question did not surface openly. It did not become discussion, but it existed in observation, in timing, in the quiet moments between tasks. The fleet continued to function. Orders were followed, responsibilities maintained. Nothing visible had broken, but cohesion was no longer automatic. It required maintenance, not through action, but through agreement, an agreement that had not been tested directly, but was now beginning to feel its limits. The environment did not assist in resolving this. Conditions remained steady. Cold persisted, wind shifted, but not dramatically. The sea continued without interruption. There was no external event to focus attention, no disruption that could unify perception, only the same pattern repeating. And within that pattern, the mind moved inward again, not toward reflection this time, but toward evaluation, subtle, measured, unresolved. What has this journey become? Not what it was intended to be, but what it is now. A continuation without confirmation, a direction without visible outcome. These thoughts did not replace action. The fleet still moved, but they existed alongside it, and that coexistence began to define the experience. Some continued to trust the process, not because they had evidence, but because they had chosen to commit to it. Others began to consider alternatives, not as decisions, but as possibilities, turning back, adjusting course, reframing the purpose. These ideas did not become plans, but they remained present. And once present, they do not disappear easily. Magellan did not engage with these possibilities. He did not open them. He did not close them. He continued, and in doing so, he delayed the moment when the journey would have to define itself, because that moment had not yet arrived. But it was approaching, not visibly, not dramatically, but through accumulation, through time, through repetition, through the slow formation of something that could not remain unaddressed forever. The fleet had now reached a point where continuation alone would no longer be enough. Not because the sea had changed, but because perception had. And when perception changes, the same conditions no longer produce the same effect. What had once been accepted without question now required reinforcement, and reinforcement, if not provided, creates space, not for immediate disruption, but for eventual change. The ships continued south. The coastline remained. The ocean did not respond, but within that stillness, something had reached its limit, not externally, but internally, a point before change, where nothing has happened yet, but something no longer whole. In the same way, and beyond that point, the journey would not continue as it had before. When structure begins to shift, the moment when change arrives is not always clear. It does not always come as a sudden break. Sometimes it begins as a difference in how things continue. By the time the fleet reached further south, the journey had already passed through several stages: expectation, continuation, uncertainty, and now something else began to form. Not a disruption, but a shift, subtle at first, almost difficult to name. The ships still moved, the coastline still extended. Nothing visible had failed, and yet the sense of stability was no longer complete, because what had once been held together by shared direction was now being held together by something more fragile. Agreement, unspoken, unconfirmed, but necessary. At the beginning, the fleet had moved as one, not because everyone believed the same thing, but because the purpose was clear enough to align them. Now, that alignment had softened, not broken. but less certain. Some continued to follow without question, not because they had more information, but because they chose not to reconsider the path. Others began to observe differently. They watched not just the coastline, but the decisions, not just the direction, but the lack of change in that direction. And within that observation, a quiet distance began to form, not physical, but perceptual. The same command was no longer received in the same way. Magellan remained consistent. He did not adjust the course. He did not acknowledge the shift directly. He continued to lead as if the journey remained exactly what it had been. And in that consistency, he created a contrast, because while his position remained fixed, the perception around him continued to move. The environment did not assist in resolving this difference. The sea remained unchanged. The coastline offered no answer. The sky did not signal direction. Everything external continued as before. And because of that, the internal movement became more noticeable. The fleet began to experience small variations in how it functioned. Nothing that could be named as failure, but enough to be felt. Communication between ships remained. Signals were still exchanged, but the timing shifted slightly. Responses were not always immediate. Movements required more confirmation, not because of confusion, but because certainty was no longer assumed. Each action required more awareness, more attention, more consideration, and in that increase, the simplicity of the journey began to fade. What had once been a straightforward continuation was now something that required maintenance, not of the ships, but of alignment. And alignment, when it must be maintained, is no longer automatic. It becomes conditional, dependent on trust, on perception, on interpretation. These elements do not move at the same pace. They do not shift in the same direction. And because of that, they create variation, not visible from a distance, but present within the experience. Some began to speak less, not out of tension, but out of uncertainty, because when direction is no longer unquestioned, language becomes more careful, more measured, more restrained. Silence, in this case, was not absence. It was adjustment, an attempt to remain within the structure without forcing it to define itself too quickly. The ships continued to move south. The coastline remained, but the journey was no longer carried by the same kind of cohesion. It was still moving, still functioning, but it required more effort to remain that way. Not physical effort, but perceptual. The effort to continue as if nothing had changed when something had. Magellan did not react. He did not correct. He did not accelerate the process. He allowed the journey to continue without interruption. And in doing so, he delayed the moment when the shift would have to be addressed, because that moment had not yet arrived. But it was closer now, not because of distance, but because of accumulation, time, repetition, uncertainty, perception, all moving together quietly without announcement toward a point where continuation alone would no longer be enough. The fleet had not yet reached that point, but it could be felt not as tension, but as a difference, a change in how the same conditions were experienced. And once that change begins, the journey does not stop. It continues, but it is no longer the same journey that began. When agreement becomes fragile, there is a difference between movement and unity. A fleet can continue to move forward even when the sense of moving together has already begun to change. By this stage of the journey, The ships still followed the same direction. They still shared the same course, but the meaning of that shared movement was no longer the same for everyone. At the beginning, direction had been enough. It had provided structure. It had aligned intention without needing explanation. Now, direction alone was no longer sufficient, because continuation without confirmation begins to require something else. Agreement, not enforced, not declared, but present. And agreement, unlike direction, is not fixed. It shifts quietly, individually, without announcement. Some on board continued to accept the journey as it had been defined, not because they had certainty, but because they had committed to the idea of it. For them, the lack of visible progress did not invalidate the path, it only extended it. Others began to hold the same experience in a different way. They did not reject the journey, but they no longer experienced it as something stable. Instead, it became something conditional, something that needed to justify itself over time. And time, at this stage, had not yet provided that justification. This difference did not create immediate conflict, but it created distance, a subtle separation between how the same reality was interpreted. The ships continued their routine. Tasks were performed, navigation maintained, communication preserved. Nothing had broken, but cohesion was no longer automatic. It required attention, not visible attention, but internal. Each person, in their own way, had to decide how to remain within the structure without that decision being spoken, without it being confirmed. And that made it fragile, because what is unspoken can hold for a long time, but it can also shift without warning. Magellan remained unchanged. He did not alter his position. He did not respond to the variation in perception. He continued to lead as if the structure remained intact, and in doing so, he reinforced it. But reinforcement is not the same as restoration. It maintains form, but it does not address change. The environment remained steady. Cold persisted. The sea did not rise. The coastline did not open. Everything external continued without interruption. And in that stillness, the internal difference became more defined, because when nothing outside changes, the smallest variation inside becomes more noticeable. Communication between ships began to reflect this, not in what was said, but in how it was received. Signals were still followed, orders still carried out, but interpretation was no longer uniform. Each message passed through perception, and perception was no longer aligned. Some followed immediately, others paused, not to resist, but to consider. And that pause, small as it was, marked a change, because in a system built on movement, even a slight delay alters rhythm, and rhythm, when altered, affects everything else. The fleet continued south, but its movement was no longer seamless. It contained variation, subtle but present, the kind that does not disrupt all at once, but accumulates over time in small differences, in timing, in response, in attention. And as these differences accumulated, the structure of agreement became more complex, not weaker in a visible sense, but less unified, more dependent on individual interpretation than shared certainty. Some continued to trust Magellan's direction without question. Others began to observe not just the path, but the persistence of that path. Why does it not change? What is it based on? How long will it continue like this? These questions did not need answers to exist. They only needed time, and time was already present. The ships showed no sign of failure. The sea offered no interruption. The journey continued, but now it carried something different, not visible, not spoken, but increasingly present, a condition in which agreement must be chosen again and again, rather than assume. And when agreement requires repetition, it becomes something else, not a foundation, but a process, one that can continue or change, depending on how long it can be sustained. The fleet had not yet reached the point where that process would break, but it had entered the stage where its limits could begin to be felt, not clearly, not directly, but enough to understand the continuation would not remain unchallenged forever. The quiet build of tension. There are moments in a journey when nothing happens on the surface, and yet something is already forming beneath it, not visible, not immediate, but present by now. Hosted minds of four. The fleet had continued far enough that the journey could no longer be understood as temporary. It had extended beyond expectation, beyond estimation, and into something that could not be easily measured. The coastline still offered no answer. The passage had not appeared, and the repetition that had once felt manageable had now lasted long enough to change its meaning, not all at once, but gradually, so gradually that it was difficult to mark when the shift had begun. The ships still moved together, but the sense of moving together was no longer complete, because agreement, which had once held the structure quietly, was now being carried more consciously, not by decision, but by awareness. Each day, the fleet continued south. Each day, the same horizon remained. Each day, the same absence persisted, and within that pattern, something began to accumulate. Not frustration, not yet, but pressure, the kind that forms when a question remains unanswered for too long. Not loudly, but steadily. It did not demand expression. It did not require conflict. It simply remained, and because it remained, it began to shape perception. The same events were no longer interpreted in the same way. A delayed response was no longer just delay. It became a signal, a hesitation, a reflection of something not fully aligned. A command given was no longer just instruction. It was received through interpretation, through evaluation, through a question that had not been there before. Why this direction? Why still forward? These questions were not spoken, but they existed. And once they exist, they begin to influence everything else. Magellan remained unchanged. He did not alter his pace. He did not explain his reasoning. He continued as if the journey itself was sufficient, and for some, that consistency remained enough. It provided a point of stability, something that did not move when everything else felt less certain. But for others, that same consistency began to feel different, not stable, but rigid, not reassuring, but unresponsive. The difference was not in the action, it was in the perception of it. And perception, once divided, does not return easily to a single form. The environment did not intervene. The sea remained calm. The wind did not disrupt. The coastline did not open. Nothing outside forced a resolution, and in that absence, the internal movement continued uninterrupted, unresolved. Communication between ships reflected this change, not through breakdown, but through variation. Signals were still sent, still received, but the clarity that once accompanied them began to soften. not lost, but less immediate, more dependent on how they were understood. Each action required slightly more attention. Each response carried slightly more weight, and in those small increases, the simplicity of the journey continued to fade. Time passed, but it no longer felt like movement. It felt like extension, a continuation that did not yet lead anywhere. And within that extension, the question returned again, not louder, but clearer. How long can this continue? The fleet had not yet reached a breaking point, but it had reached a point where continuation required more than before, not in effort, but in agreement. And that agreement was no longer silent. It was present, felt, carried each day, in every action, in every pause, in every moment where the journey did not resolve itself. The ships continued south. The ocean remained. The coastline extended. But beneath that stillness, something had already changed. Not visibly, not dramatically, but enough to alter what would come next. Because once pressure forms, even quietly, it does not disappear. It waits, and over time, it finds a way to surface. When pressure becomes action, there is a point in any long journey where what has been carried quietly can no longer remain unseen, not because it changes suddenly, but because it has existed long enough to take form. By now, the fleet had moved through distance that could not easily be reversed. The coastline still extended south. The passage had not appeared, and the pattern that had defined the journey remained unchanged. But what had been forming beneath that pattern was no longer only internal. It had begun to move outward, not as disruption, but as decision. The shift did not begin with a single moment. It began with alignment, not of the entire fleet, but of a few. Those who had begun to interpret the journey in the same way, not as continuation, but as extension, without resolution. They did not arrive at this understanding together. Each had reached it in their own time, through observation, through repetition, through the quiet accumulation of unanswered questions, and eventually those individual perceptions found each other, not loudly, not publicly, but through recognition, a shared awareness that did not need to be explained because it had been experienced in the same way. At first, nothing changed externally. The ships still moved, orders were still followed, the structure remained, but within that structure, a second layer had formed, one that did not align with the original direction, not yet in action, but in intention. And intention, once it becomes shared, moves toward expression. The moment itself did not arrive with noise. It did not break suddenly into conflict. It appeared as a change in behavior, subtle at first, a delay that became refusal, a hesitation that became decision, commands that were no longer carried out in the same way, not rejected openly, but altered, redirected. And in that alteration, the structure of the fleet began to shift, because a system built on shared direction cannot remain unchanged when direction is no longer shared. Magellan did not respond immediately, not because he was unaware, but because the nature of the shift required recognition before reaction. What was happening was not confusion. It was not error. It was divergence, a separation between those who would continue and those who would not. This separation did not need to be declared. It was already present in action. The ships no longer move with the same cohesion, not dramatically, but enough to be seen, enough to be understood. At that point, the journey reached its first real turning, not in geography, but in structure, because from that moment forward, the fleet would not be defined only by its direction. It would be defined by how it held together, or did not. Magellan acted not with speed, not with force, but with clarity. His response was not designed to argue with the change. It was designed to define it, to make visible what had already been forming. And once visible, it could no longer remain uncertain. The outcome was not chaotic. It did not unfold as a sudden collapse. It was controlled, decisive. Those who had moved against the original structure were confronted not as individuals, but as a divergence that could not continue alongside the original path. Some were removed, some were left behind, others returned to the structure, not necessarily in belief, but in position. The fleet, in its visible form, became unified again, but that unity was no longer the same. It was no longer based on shared expectation. It was based on defined direction, a difference that matters, because one is chosen freely, the other is maintained. The ships continued south as before. The coastline remained. The passage had still not appeared, and yet something fundamental had changed, not in the sea, not in the land, but in the nature of the journey. It was no longer a shared exploration. It had become a committed path, one that would continue, not because everyone believed in it, but because it had been set. And from that point forward, the question was no longer whether the journey would continue. It would. The question had changed to something quieter, more distant, but more final. Where or me would it lead? Entering the unknown ocean. After a long stretch of coastline that had offered no answer, the change, when it came, did not arrive with noise. It appeared quietly, almost gently. The passage they had been searching for did not announce itself. There were no signs placed along the shore, no clear boundary between what had been known and what was about to begin. There was only a narrowing of land, a subtle shift in how the coastline moved, and then, water that did not behave the same way. The fleet had reached what would later be called a strait, but at the time it was simply uncertainty taking shape. The ships slowed, not out of hesitation, but out of necessity, because movement here required attention. The water narrowed, turned, divided. Paths appeared that did not clearly lead anywhere. Channels opened and then curved out of sight. The land rose sharply on both sides, not welcoming, not guiding, simply present. The fleet moved forward, one section at a time, not as a wide formation, but as individual vessels, navigating through a space that did not allow for distance. Each ship had to find its way through the same uncertainty, but not always in the same moment. Signals passed between them, slowly, carefully. Each decision carried weight, not because it was dramatic, but because it could not be reversed easily. The passage did not offer reassurance. It did not become clearer as they moved deeper. In some places, it seemed to open. In others, it narrowed again. The sense of direction was no longer continuous. It had to be rebuilt at each turn, and time, which had once stretched evenly across the journey, now moved differently. Short distances required long attention. Progress could not be measured in the same way. Days passed without a clear sense of how far they had gone, only that they were still moving, still searching within the movement itself. At times, the wind fell silent. At others, it shifted without warning. The ships adjusted, not in unison, but in response to what each encountered. And within that, the fleet became something different, not a single structure, but a collection of parts moving through the same space. Eventually, one of the ships did not return. It had been sent ahead to explore, to find a way forward, but it did not come back. At first, this absence was treated as delay, then as uncertainty, and finally as loss. No explanation was found, only the recognition that not all paths would lead to the same place. The fleet continued with fewer ships, with less certainty, but still moving, because by now, turning back was no longer the simpler option. The passage extended, longer than expected, more complex than it had first appeared, and yet it did not close. It continued to offer just enough space for movement, just enough direction to suggest that it might lead somewhere. And so they followed it, not because it was clear, but because it existed, until one day, without transition, the land fell away. The narrow channels ended, the boundaries disappeared, and in front of them there was only open water, not broken by land, not defined by edges, a surface that stretched beyond sight, still wide, uninterrupted. This was not the ocean they had known before. It did not carry the same movement, the same unpredictability. It was calmer, smoother, almost silent. And because of that, it felt different, not safer, but more distant, as if the world itself had opened into something that did not yet have meaning. They had found what they had been searching for, a way through, a connection between two bodies of water. But what lay ahead was not an ending, it was another beginning. And this beginning did not come with direction, only space, endless, unmarked, and waiting. The ocean that does not end. When they entered the open water, there was no clear moment, but marked the transition. The land simply disappeared, not suddenly, not dramatically. It moved further away until it was no longer part of what could be seen. And then, it was gone. What remained was a surface that did not change. Day after day, the horizon stayed the same, a line that never came closer, never shifted, never offered variation. At first, this felt like success. The passage had been found. The fleet had crossed what others had not. And now there was nothing left to block their way, only distance. And distance, in the beginning, does not feel heavy. It feels open, possible. The ocean itself appeared calm, so calm that it seemed almost intentional. The water moved with a softness that did not interrupt the ships. The wind, when it came, was steady, predictable. Nothing in the environment suggested difficulty, and that was what made it difficult to understand, because nothing signaled what was coming. Days passed, then more days. The pattern did not change. The sky rose and fell in the same way. Light spread across the water each morning and withdrew each evening. But between those moments, there was no variation, no land, no birds, no signs of life that could be followed, only water and sky. The ships continued forward, not quickly, but consistently, and yet the distance they covered did not feel like progress, because progress requires reference, something that changes, something that marks movement. Here, there was none. The ocean did not provide it, and so time began to feel different, not slower, not faster, but extended, as if each day was not separate from the last, but connected into one continuous span. Food supplies began to shift, not in quantity at first, but in quality. What had once been stored with expectation of a journey became something else. It aged, dried, hardened, lost its form. Water, once sufficient, was measured more carefully, not out of fear, but out of awareness that what remained had to last longer than planned. Still, the surface of the ocean did not reflect this change. It remained calm, unbroken, almost reassuring. And that contrast began to shape the experience, because nothing outside matched what was happening within. The ships moved through a world that appeared stable, while the reality of the journey became less certain. Days continued, then weeks. The pattern held. The horizon remained. The sea did not resist. It did not challenge. It did not demand. It simply extended further than expected, further than measured. At times, the wind would soften and movement would slow even more. The ships would drift, not stopped, but barely progressing. And in those moments, the stillness became more complete. The ocean was no longer just wide. It was present in every direction, without boundary, without interruption, without any signal that something else existed beyond it. The men on board adjusted, not through decision, but through repetition. Routines formed, not because they were planned, but because they were needed to give shape to days that no longer had one, to divide time that had begun to merge. And still, the ocean remained unchanged. It did not respond to their presence. It did not acknowledge their movement. It simply held them within it as they continued forward into distance that had no visible end. At some point, the question returned, not loudly, not urgently, but clearly. How far does this go? There was no answer, only the continuation of the same horizon, the same water, the same sky, and the quiet understanding that this part of the journey was not about direction. It was about endurance, not against something visible, but against something that did not change. Because when the world around you remains the same for too long, it begins to reshape how you experience time, how you measure progress, and how you understand what it means to move forward. The ships continued, the ocean remained, and between those two things, the journey extended into something that could not yet be completed, only continued. When distance becomes weight, at some point, distance stops feeling like space. It becomes something else, not visible, not measurable in the usual way, but present, felt in small changes that do not announce themselves. The ocean had not changed. The horizon remained the same. The surface still moved with a quiet rhythm that did not resist the ships. But inside the journey, something had begun to shift. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily. The supplies that had once been part of routine were no longer taken for granted. Food had changed, not only in amount, but in form. What remained was no longer fresh, no longer stable. It had hardened, broken, lost what it once was. Eating became slower, not because there was more time, but because there was less certainty in what was being consumed. Water, more than anything else, began to define the day. It was measured, observed, divided, not out of panic, but out of necessity that could no longer be ignored. Each portion was not only what was needed now, It was what had to remain for later, and later had not yet revealed itself. The body responded, at first with adjustment, then with fatigue, not overwhelming, not immediate, but present in ways that were difficult to separate from the repetition of the journey. Movement slowed, not in the ships, but in the people. Tasks that had once required no effort began to take longer, not because they were harder, but because energy was no longer constant. It came and went, without pattern, without warning. The mind followed, not breaking, but shifting. Thoughts became simpler, not by choice, but by necessity. Complex ideas required energy, and energy was no longer always available. Conversation changed, not in content, but in duration. Shorter, less frequent. Pauses between words became longer. Silence no longer needed explanation. It became part of the rhythm. The ocean continued, unchanged. It did not reflect what was happening. It did not respond to the slow reduction of strength. It did not offer contrast, only continuity. And that continuity made everything else more difficult to recognize, because change is easier to see when something around it shifts. Here, nothing did, and so the changes had to be felt internally through awareness that did not always arrive clearly. Sleep, when it came, was not always rest. It was interruption, a break in awareness that did not fully restore what had been used. Waking did not feel like beginning again. It felt like continuation. The same day extended through a different light. The same conditions repeated without variation. Time, which had once been structured by progress, lost that structure. It became something else, not divided into meaningful parts, but stretched, continuous, difficult to separate into beginning and end. The ships moved. That did not change, but the experience of moving no longer carried the same meaning. It was no longer about reaching something. It was about continuing through something that had not yet finished. At moments, the wind would return, offering movement, speed, a sense of direction. But even that did not alter what had already formed, because direction without destination does not resolve anything. It only extends the path. The question returned again, quietly, without urgency. How much further? There was no answer, only the same horizon, the same surface, the same pattern that had now lasted long enough to become something else. Not just environment, but condition. The journey had entered a phase where nothing outside needed to change for everything inside to feel different. Because when distance continues without interruption, it begins to take form, not as something seen, but as something carried in the body, in the mind, in the space between moments, where effort is required to continue. The ships remained, the ocean remained, and between them, the journey became something heavier, not because it resisted, but because it did not end. The first sign of land. There is a moment in a long journey when change does not arrive as something seen clearly. It arrives as a difference, small, uncertain, almost easy to ignore. After weeks of uninterrupted ocean, the pattern had become complete. Water, sky, horizon, nothing else. And because that pattern had remained unchanged for so long, anything different would not appear as certainty. It would appear as possibility. At first, it was not land. It was something less defined, a variation in what had always been the same. The water moved, moved in a slightly different way, not enough to suggest direction, but enough to be noticed. Then something else, a presence that did not belong to the open ocean, debris, not from the ships, not from the journey, something natural, carried, floating, unfamiliar, the kind of detail that would have been ignored before. But now, after so much sameness, it held weight. The ships continued. No change in direction, no immediate reaction, because possibility is not the same as confirmation, and confirmation had not yet arrived. Then another sign, birds, not many, not close, but present, moving across the sky in a way that did not follow the ships. That alone was enough to shift perception, because birds do not remain over empty ocean for long. They move between places, between points that exist, and that meant something else existed somewhere. Still, nothing was visible, only these small signals, these quiet differences that suggested what had not yet been seen. Time passed, not long, but long enough for awareness to change. The same horizon was now observed differently, not as absence, but as something that might contain what had been missing. Then, idea of finally, it appeared, not suddenly, not sharply, a shape faint, distant, almost indistinguishable from the line that had always been there. At first, it could have been nothing, a distortion, a trick of light, something created by distance itself. But it remained, and as the ships moved, it did not disappear. It became clearer, slowly, gradually, until it could no longer be mistaken for anything else. Land. After weeks of nothing changing, this did not feel like discovery. It felt like interruption, a break in something that had seemed endless. The ships did not rush. They continued forward as they had before, but the meaning of that movement had changed, because now there was something ahead, something that did not move, something that would not disappear as they approached. As they drew closer, details emerged, shapes, contours, a structure that replaced the empty line of the horizon, and with it, a shift, not in the ocean. It remained as it was, but in the journey, because this was not the end. It was not the destination they had set out to reach. It was something else, an interruption that would become a turning point, because land does not only offer relief, it introduces change, new conditions, new decisions, new consequences. The long stretch of open water had required endurance, continuation, the ability to remain when nothing changed. But now something had changed, and that meant the nature of the journey would change with it. The ships approached, the land remained, no longer distant, no longer uncertain, and within that arrival, the quiet phase of the journey came to an end, not with noise, not with relief, but with a shift from endurance to encounter, from stillness to consequence, and whatever came next would no longer be defined by distance alone, but by what existed on the shore. They had finally reached the shore that changes everything. When land finally becomes close enough to define itself clearly, the journey does not end, it changes. The ocean, which had held the ships for so long, begins to recede in meaning, not because it disappears, but because something else takes its place. The shoreline, at first, it is only form, contours, lines that separate water from land. But as the ships approach, that form becomes detail, color, texture, movement. The land is not empty. It never was. It holds its own rhythm, its own presence, and that presence begins to replace the silence of the open ocean. The ships slow, not out of uncertainty this time, but out of recognition, because movement here requires a different kind of attention. The water near the shore does not behave the same way. It shifts, shallower, less predictable. The ships adjust carefully, gradually, until the distance between them and the land can no longer be measured only by sight. It becomes proximity, and with proximity comes awareness. At first, the land observes quietly from a distance. Then it responds, not with force, not with resistance, but with presence. Figures appear, small, distant, moving along the edge of the water, watching. The ships do not rush forward. They remain floating, balanced between what they have left and what they have not yet entered. Because this moment is not only arrival, it is transition. The men on board observe in return, not with the same gaze they had held for the ocean. This is different. The ocean did not look back. The land does, and that changes how it is experienced. The first contact does not happen immediately. It forms slowly through distance, through repeated observation, through the gradual understanding that both sides are aware of each other. Small boats move across the water, not quickly, not cautiously, but steadily, closing the space between two worlds that had not met before. There is no shared language, no structure that defines what comes next. Only presence and interpretation. Gestures replace words. Movement replaces explanation. Each action is observed before it is understood, and understanding does not arrive all at once. It builds piece by piece, moment by moment. The men who had crossed the vast, unchanging ocean now faced something that did not extend endlessly, something that responded, something that existed outside the path they had followed. This required adjustment, not of direction, but of perception, because the journey was no longer only about moving forward. It was about entering a space that already belonged to something else. The exchange that followed was simple, not in meaning, but in form. Objects passed from one side to the other. Small things without weight in themselves, but carrying significance, because they mark the first connection, the first moment where distance was replaced by interaction. No one knew what would come next, not clearly, not fully, because this was not a destination that had been planned. It was an arrival into something that had not been defined, and that meant the journey had entered a new phase, one that would no longer be shaped by distance or endurance alone, but by encounter, by interpretation, by decisions that could not be undone. In the same way as direction at sea, the ships remained near the shore. The land remained present, and between them something had begun, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that would quietly determine what came next. Understanding without language. When two worlds meet without preparation, the first moments are rarely defined by clarity. They are shaped by interpretation. Each side sees the other through what they already know, and what they already know is not the same. The ships remained near the shore, not anchored deeply, not fully committed to land, still held partly by the ocean. And in that in-between space, interaction continued. The small boats moved back and forth more frequently now. The distance that had once required caution began to feel familiar, not safe, but known. The figures from the shore approached without hesitation. Their movements were steady, unforced, as if this moment was not unusual. To them, they had seen strangers before, or perhaps they understood that presence does not always mean threat. On board, the men watched closely, not with fear, but with attention, because every detail carried meaning, even when that meaning could not yet be understood. The exchanges continued. Objects passed hands again, not randomly, but with growing intention. Food, water, materials, simple things. Yet each one became a signal, not just of need, but of possibility, because through these exchanges, a pattern began to form. Not a shared language, but a shared rhythm. Offer, receive, pause, observe, repeat. And within that rhythm, a kind of understanding began to emerge. Not spoken, not defined, but present. Still, this understanding was not complete, because meaning is not only in action, it is in interpretation. And interpretation depends on what each side believes is happening. For the men who had crossed the ocean, this was arrival, a place within a larger journey, a point on a path that continued beyond it. For those on the shore, this was something else, not part of a larger route, but a moment that existed entirely in the present. Two different ways of understanding the same encounter, and within that difference, small gaps appeared, not immediately visible, not disruptive, but present. A gesture that meant openness on one side might not carry the same meaning on the other. An object given as a sign of exchange might be received as something else, not conflict, not yet, but divergence, the kind that forms when meaning is not shared completely. Time passed, the interactions continued, and with repetition, familiarity grew, not fully, but enough to reduce hesitation. The boats moved more easily. The distance between ship and shore became less significant. More men stepped onto land carefully, not as a full arrival, but as a continuation of the exchange. The ground felt different, solid, unmoving. After so long at sea, this alone required adjustment. Steps were slower, not from weakness, but from unfamiliarity, because stability had been replaced by motion. For so long, that stillness felt new. On the shore, the presence of the newcomers was observed, not rejected, not fully accepted, but included within the space that already existed. The two groups stood near each other, not speaking, but communicating through movement, through expression, through attention to what the other did. And in that shared space, something continued to build, not agreement, but connection. A recognition that both sides were now part of the same moment. Yet beneath that connection, the earlier difference remained, not visible, not active, but still there, because understanding without language can only extend so far. Beyond that point, something else is needed, and when it is not present, the space between meanings does not disappear. It waits, and over time, it begins to shape what follows. The ocean remained behind them, the land remained before them, and between those two worlds, the journey continued, no longer defined by distance, but by the quiet complexity of meeting something that cannot yet be fully understood. When direction changes meaning, at sea, direction is simple. You move forward or you do not. The path is defined by distance, by continuation, by the decision to remain in motion. But on land, direction becomes something else. It is no longer only about movement. It is about choice, and choice carries consequence in a different way. After the first encounters, the presence of the fleet began to extend beyond observation. It was no longer just an arrival. It became involvement, not immediately, not intentionally, but gradually. The exchanges continued. The familiarity increased, and within that familiarity, something else began to form. Expectation, not spoken, but implied, because repeated interaction creates patterns, and patterns create meaning. What had begun as simple exchange now carried weight. Gestures were no longer neutral. They were interpreted as agreement, as alignment, as connection that extended beyond the moment. For Magellan, this shift was not separate from the journey. It became part of it. The land was no longer just a place to reach. It was a place to act within, to influence, to shape. And that decision, quiet at first, began to change the nature of everything that followed. The people of the shore had their own structures, their own relationships, their own ways of defining authority. Not all of these were visible, not all of them were understood, but they were present, and entering that space meant entering those structures, whether intentionally or not. Magellan did not remain at the edge. He moved inward, not physically at first, but through action, through agreement, through the acceptance of one side over another. What had once been a meeting between two worlds began to divide into positions, not all at once, but clearly enough to be felt. And once that division exists, neutrality becomes difficult to maintain, because presence is no longer only presence. It becomes alignment. The decision did not appear as a turning point. It did not announce itself as something that would change everything. It appeared as continuation, as the next step within a series of steps that had already been taken. But this step was different because it moved beyond observation and into involvement. The response from the land reflected this change, not immediately, not as conflict, but as resistance, subtle at first, a difference in behavior, a withdrawal of openness, a hesitation that had not been there before. Signals that something had shifted, but signals are not always recognized when they first appear, especially when the direction of the journey has already been set. Magellan continued, not with hesitation, not with doubt, but with the same clarity that had carried him across the ocean. And that clarity, which had once been strength, now entered a different environment, one that did not respond in the same way as the sea, because on land other forces exist, other intentions, other structures that do not yield to a single direction. The moment approached without urgency, without visible build-up, but it approached because once involvement begins, outcomes follow. Not immediately, but inevitably. The space between the two groups changed, not in distance, but in meaning. The same ground now held different interpretations. The same actions carried different weight, and within that shift, the path forward was no longer as open as it had been at sea. It had narrowed, not physically, but in possibility, because each step now led not just further into the journey, but deeper into a situation that could not be left in the same way. The ocean, which had once defined everything, now remained behind them, still present, still vast, but no longer central. because the journey had moved into something else, something that did not stretch endlessly, something that responded. And in that response, the next moment was already forming, not loudly, not visibly, but with certainty, because once direction changes meaning, what follows is no longer only movement, it is consequence. The end of a journey that continues. There are moments in a journey that are remembered as endings, but when they arrive, they do not always feel like conclusions. Sometimes they feel like continuation, moving through a different form. The situation on land had already begun to change, not suddenly, not visibly, but in the way meaning had shifted between those involved. The alignment that had formed did not remain stable, because alignment without full understanding cannot hold indefinitely, and when it begins to separate, it does not always do so with clarity. It changes through action. Magellan chose to act not from hesitation, not from uncertainty, but from the same conviction that had guided him across oceans. He stepped forward into a situation that was no longer defined by distance or endurance, but by interaction, by response, by forces that could not be controlled. In the same way as wind or tide, the moment did not unfold as something sudden. It did not break apart into chaos all at once. It formed gradually through movement, through decisions that could not be taken back. And within that unfolding, Magellan did not step away. He remained present, committed to the direction he had chosen until the moment where that direction could no longer continue. His life ended there, not at sea, not in the vast, silent distance that had defined so much of the journey, but on land, in a place that had only recently entered the path of the expedition. And in that moment, the journey lost the person who had defined it. But it did not end, because a journey is not only carried by the one who begins it, it is carried by those who continue. The remaining ships did not turn back, not immediately, not completely. They adjusted, reduced, reorganized, but still moving, because by now the journey had become something larger than its origin. It was no longer only about finding a path. It had become the path itself. One ship would eventually remain, the others lost along the way, not in a single event, but through time, through distance, through the accumulation of everything the journey required. The final ship continued west across waters that were no longer unknown in the same way, but still not familiar. It moved through ports, through exchanges, through decisions that carried the weight of everything that had already happened, until, after years, it returned not to the same place as before, because no journey returns in the same way it began, but to a point that completed the path, a circle not drawn intentionally, but formed through continuation, through the refusal to stop. Out of all who had begun, only a small number remained. The rest had been left along the way, at sea, on land, in places that had become part of the journey without ever being its destination. And yet, what remained was not loss alone. It was something else, something that could not be seen during the journey itself, only understood after it had ended, that the world was not as divided as it had once appeared. That distance could be crossed, that oceans could connect rather than separate, not easily, not without cost, but truly The journey had revealed this not through intention alone, but through endurance, through continuation across spaces that had not been fully known. And in doing so, it changed how those spaces would be understood. From that point forward, Magellan did not complete the journey, but the journey completed something he had begun. And in that way, his path did not end where he did. It continued across water, across time, through those who carried it forward, until the world itself became something that could be traveled in a single direction, not because it was small, but because it was connected. That understanding, quiet as it is, remains long after the ships have returned, long after the ocean has settled again, long after the journey has ended for those who lived it. Because some journeys do not disappear, they become part of how the world is seen, even when everything else has faded back into stillness.